Hello, everybody.
Hello.
We got a young student there tonight.
मैं वेट लूज करना चाह रहा हूँ। मैं इसलिए कह रहा हूँ कि जल्दी खाना खाना चाह रहा हूँ 6 बजे। ये लोग पता नहीं क्या
else, not him. But someone else just I'm gonna quickly do the sorry kicker. Sorry, Mama.
So I'm going to mute everybody. You're welcome to unmute yourself if you need something. You want to ask a question, and you can also do it through the chat feature. People were good at doing that last night. So that's good. Give everybody a couple more minutes. This is the period before the lecture where you can ask questions if you have any, or you can go over the chapter a little bit. We're starting with chapter 18 tonight, leases and the landlord-tenant relationship. So it's a good chapter. And again, it'll clear up some questions tonight and probably make more questions tonight. So again, give everybody a couple more minutes to get signed in before we actually get started. Somebody said my chair squeaks too much. I tried to put WD-40 on it. Didn't stop the squeaking yet, though. Hot day today. I hope everybody stayed cool. I had a couple of houses that I had to do broker's price opinions on. And a broker's price opinion is when somebody is thinking of selling their house and they ask me to come out and tell them what I think it's worth. Also, I had to show a tenant the property in New Brunswick, and I had to let a cleaning company in one of my listings to get the rugs cleaned so we could sell it for the most amount of money possible for this house. The floors, the hardwood floors and the rugs got cleaned, so it looks really good. And again, if you got a question, here's a question. That's what I like to see. Can you tell the difference between redlining and blockbusting? Yep, that's an easy one. Blockbusting is when somebody goes to a home seller, somebody who owns a home, and in 1965 in Newark, we had riots in Newark after in 1969, I'm sorry. After Martin Luther King was assassinated, there were riots in Newark and in many other American cities. And in Newark, there was an Italian neighborhood that was up off of Bloomfield Avenue. And after the riots, unscrupulous real estate brokers went to all the Italian people who lived in the neighborhood, and they told them, you'd better sell your house quick because African Americans are moving into the neighborhood. That's an exact example of blockbusting. Another word for blockbusting is panic peddling. Both blockbusting and panic peddling mean that you induce people to sell their houses by implying that a protected class is moving into the neighborhood. So blockbusting and panic peddling are the same thing. And we are required to, anytime we mail or distribute more than 3 things on one block in 1 month, 3 things on one block in 1 month, we have to keep a record for 6 years of what we sent so that you can prove that you did not blockbust or panic peddle. Now, redlining is something different. Redlining is where insurance companies, and specifically it was the FHA security product that lenders use in order to agree to lend you a mortgage amount with such a small down payment, and the down payment is as small as 3.5%, which is a big risk to the bank. So the FHA, so they're in the business of insuring loans. They're a government entity that's in the business of insuring loans. And that insurance on those loans benefits the lender. In the event that you don't pay off your mortgage and you get foreclosed, that insurance benefits the lender. So what redlining was the FHA. This is a government entity. This is not just, some weird guy who has a grudge. This is a government entity. They would draw red lines around African-American neighborhoods, and they would not insure loans in those neighborhoods. So that's what redlining is. Not issuing loans in an area because of the racial or ethnic background of the inhabitants of that neighborhood. And, specifically, they would color those map areas red, and that would signify that African Americans live there, and they would not insure loans in those areas. Okay. Now, there's another type of discrimination that's specifically made illegal, and that's steering. Steering is if you have somebody who is Jewish and they come in and you only show them houses in Highland Park, which has a very high Jewish population, and you don't show them houses in New Brunswick, which has a very high Spanish population or Latino population. That's steering. When you steer somebody to a certain neighborhood based on their race or their protected class, or you steer them away from a certain neighborhood based on their race or their protected class. So we have steering, we have blockbusting, which is also known as panic peddling, and we have redlining. All three things are made illegal under several different laws that we have under Fair Housing and the Truth in Lending Act, and the National Home Mortgage Disclosure Act. All of them work to make those things illegal, which are, never, no matter what you call them, they're a form of discrimination. Okay, you're welcome. I did get a message today from one of the students that I appreciate very much, and I want to say thank you. I don't know if he's on yet, but PSI is giving the test. PSI is, of course, backed up. Of course, if you want the test in North Brunswick, you might have to wait a couple of weeks to a month, but they do have other locations where the test is available much sooner than that. So anybody who's getting close to getting signed out, you might want to ask to get signed out a little bit early and continue to come to class, but go ahead and schedule your test, because if the earliest you can get a test scheduled is a month from now, you don't want to wait till the end and then schedule the test and have to wait a month. PSI told one of our people who's in our class that they are taking appropriate precautions for Corona. It's one of the reasons they're backed up. They're only working at half capacity, and people are wearing masks when they take the test.
Hey Bruce, can I assume that my class, I just started yesterday, so I can assume that 10 weeks from now I'm going to be finished. So can I book the test in advance?
No, you have to wait until I sign you out.
Right.
So I would wait a little longer than if you just signed up a couple days ago, because you still have probably 9 weeks to go or 8 weeks to go.
Okay.
And when you get down to when you only have 2 or 3 weeks to go, then go ahead and I'll sign you out so you can schedule the class.
Okay. Okay.
I did send everybody the link for last night's class. I didn't have a good chance to edit it, but so what? I have no vanity. I
got the math question and the 200 question, but I did not get a link for the video.
You didn't get which one? The link?
I got a math question and then 200 questions for the exam. I received that email, but I did not get the link.
All right, the links are to the YouTubes, so I'll have to send them out. I'll send the links out again.
Okay, thank you.
So while we're waiting for the class to start, I'll tell you that we are about to have a national crisis on landlord-tenant relationships, because if the president goes ahead and cuts that $600 a month to $200, there are many, many, many people who are renting who will not be able to pay their rent. And there are many, many landlords who, if they don't get their rent, can't pay their mortgage. So there's going to be a landlord-tenant crisis as we move forward. One of the reasons that we may have a landlord-tenant crisis is some of the hedge funds are now buying up rental properties, and what they're doing is they're making those those rental properties into leveraged securities, so to speak. Instead of mortgage-backed securities, they're making into lease-backed securities and having a secondary market for them. And they're going to be brutal in terms of evicting people. They don't care. And the evictions right now are in a forbearance. You're not allowed to file for eviction right now, even if somebody is not paying. But that doesn't mean that the people who aren't paying don't have to pay ever. It just means that there's a forbearance. Forbearance means you just don't have to pay right now. At the back of this chapter is the whole New Jersey Truth in Renting Act. We're not going to go into that act, the part of the act at the end of the chapter. You're welcome to read all that. That's in the small print, where it gets to be the small print. There's not many questions on the test about that. The Truth in Renting Act starts on page 370, but there's something very important in the Truth in Renting Act that you might want to keep your eye on, and that's that there is a grounds for eviction section in there, and it gives the A through Q criteria that you can evict somebody for in New Jersey. And that's very important because you don't always, if you're a landlord, you're not always looking to evict people just because they're not paying rent. You may be looking to evict them because you want to change the house into a bigger house, or you want to remodel the whole house. So on page 382 and 383 and 384 and 385 is the A through Q criteria for being able to evict somebody, the clauses for eviction. And again, we're not going to go through too much that part of the chapter. That's the law itself. But you want to put a bookmarker in there if you're a landlord, so that someday when you have trying to evict somebody that you're not really happy with, you can see what the A through Q criteria are. So it's MNOPQ, MNOPQ. That's 17 different reasons that you can evict somebody. Not paying rent being the first one. And in New Jersey, it's not so easy to evict someone, but it's not so hard as long as you follow all the rules and you do all the paperwork. If you have somebody who was a tenant, and today is 29th, I think, there's 2 more days in this month. If you have somebody who hasn't paid their rent yet for July, you can't start eviction process even in normal times until they're a month behind. So if they hadn't paid their rent yet by the 29th, you can't start eviction. You can charge them a late fee, but on August 1st, then you could start the eviction process. That's unfortunate because in other states, they let you start earlier, because it's unfortunate because if you're a landlord, you've already burned through the month and you're not going to have an easy time getting that money back. So again, in New Jersey, we're kind of a little bit tenant friendly, where other states are very landlord friendly. And that's something to remember when you're thinking about becoming a landlord. You will have times that you will have to evict people. Then we're getting 10 more minutes and we'll get started with the class. Don't forget, at the end of each chapter, there are questions, and you should be working on the questions at the end of the chapter. The answers to those questions are in the back of the book, so you should check your answers. And if you have a problem with one of the questions, you don't understand the answer, just let me know and we'll go over it in class. Again, the questions in the back of the chapters of the book and the sample 110 question tests that are in the back of the book. They're decent tests. They're not the best, but they're decent tests. So don't be afraid to play around. Okay, can I explain how you register for the PSI? So to register for the PSI exam, I have to sign you out. So what you're going to do is you're going to call my wife when you're ready, text her so she can be in front of she has to be in front of the specific computer. That's our terminal to the state. So you're gonna call my wife or text her, let her know you want to, again, give her a heads up. She's going to log you out. She'll need your social security number and your date of birth, 2 phone numbers. You can give the same number twice if you want to, but there's a required field for 2 phone numbers. She'll enter you into the system, and as soon as she enters you into the system, you will be able to schedule your test. And you're going to schedule your test through PSI. The website is on the licensing and education section of the real estate commissions. You Google New Jersey Real Estate Commission licensing and education, and that page comes up on the bottom right-hand corner is the link to PSI. I'll give you when you sign out with my wife, she'll also give you the URL for the PSI link, and you can do it on the phone, by the way. The nice person from class who went to PSI today for me to check up got a phone number for PSI. Let's see if I can find that real quick on my phone. PSI customer service. PSI customer service. Somebody just signed on, so I'll let them get on first. PSI customer service is 800-733-9267. 800-733-9267. And Joanna, you texted Lee today. Her number is 732-266-3366. 732-266-3366. So I don't know whether she got your message or not today, but she will. I'll tell her that you're looking for her so they can get signed out. All right. Again, just a couple more minutes and we'll get started. Still a few minutes early to start for the whole class. Easy night tonight. I'm going to try to give you guys a test one of the days next week, either Tuesday or Wednesday. I haven't figured out exactly the best way to do it so that you all have it and then we can all get it graded. I have my daughter trying to set up a Quizlet account for me and then put the test into Quizlet. Hopefully I can get that done. If I can't, we'll just have I'll send you everybody out a PDF. You print it out, you take the test, and then we'll go over it one of the days, either Tuesday or Wednesday of next week. The next day we'll go over it. There will be a class tomorrow night, a bonus class tomorrow night. The bonus class tomorrow night is going to be, just let me check my calendar. The bonus class tomorrow night is going to be at 7:30, and it's going to be on appraising. So the bonus class tomorrow night is going to be at 7:30 p.m. and it's going to be on appraising. I'll send everybody a link. I'll record it, and I'll put it into the YouTube site so that we can everybody has it. That'll be a bonus one on Wednesday night. On Thursday night to add a few more hours to class so that we can eat up a couple more hours. And if you missed that message, I will send everybody an email anyway. All right, just another 5 more minutes and we'll get going. we did have some internet trouble here today. So I'm not going to put my video on. When I called Zoom, Zoom told me that if the internet is showing up as unstable or it's fading in and out, everybody should turn off their cameras, because I don't need to see you, and you don't need to see me. You just need to see the slides. And they said that will help us get by with the bandwidth we have. Everybody's cameras are off, so I won't be putting my camera on, so you can see me up in the right-hand corner. You won't be able to tell what I'm drinking tonight when I'm drinking, but you'll have to guess.
Bruce, what time the classes will be tomorrow?
7:30.
7:30? Okay.
And it'll be a short class. It'll be just the praising. And again, I will record it and I will post it on YouTube after the class. And I might even try a class or two over the weekend. I'm just trying to get some more single classes done to make it better on YouTube. So, every class on YouTube isn't 2 hours. So again, I'll send everybody an email, let them know. And these aren't required classes. They're just extra ones. You can use them to build some more time. And it gives me an opportunity to have smaller segments on YouTube so that you don't have to, always be looking at.
And I'm sorry, we need to report, keep a record of our own time?
Yes. And more importantly, and much more importantly, in your books, I would suggest you have a highlighter. And I would suggest as we do a chapter, because once I start a specific chapter, I really kind of stick in that chapter. I suggest you highlight as I go along, because I'm kind of following the outline in the chapter. And that's a way for you to tell what chapters we've done. Because if you look into a chapter and you haven't highlighted it all, that means we probably didn't do it. And you want to try to make sure that I give you every chapter at least 2 times and probably 3 times in order for you to really be a proficient in the chapter. There's too many technical terms and too many definitions and even foreign words, like lis pendens in Latin and curatur vi for a life estate, which is French, and a novation for a new agreement, which is Spanish. All kinds of different languages that we pull terms from, because in English we steal vocabulary from all different languages. So it really helps if you highlight in your book.
Okay, good to know.
Right, we got a couple more people drifted in just 2 more minutes, and then we'll get started. Hello, everybody. A couple more people. 1 more minute. Okay, chapter 18, leases and landlord tenant. These last couple people in. Chapter 18, leases and landlord tenant. So a lease is an arrangement whereby the landlord offers the tenant, the lessee, the right to use a specific piece of real estate, for a agreed to time. Property is divided between real property and personal property. Real property implies a freehold estate and a completeness of the holding of the bundle of rights for an indefinite period of time. So again, freehold, which is the ownership of real estate, real property. Freehold, real property is an ownership for an indefinite period of time, and you have all of the bundle of rights. You have a completeness of the bundle of rights. So that's freehold. That's real property. That's the definition of real property. A leasehold estate is personal property. So a leasehold estate is personal property. And a personal property, as the tenant, you are borrowing the right of possession for a specific or a definite period of time. So remember, in a freehold estate, which is real estate, which is real property, you have the right of ownership for an indefinite period of time. In a lease, which is personal property, you have the the right of possession for a definite period of time. And what is that definite period of time? It's the period of your lease. That definite period of time is the period of your lease. Let's get a few more people in here. So when you're leasing a property, when you are the tenant in the property, you are borrowing the right of possession. When you are a tenant in with the property, you are borrowing the right of possession. And at the end of your lease, that right of possession goes back to the landlord. Another name for a lease is a demise, D-E-M-I-S-E. So a demise is another name for a lease. A demise is lending the tenant the right of possession for a specific period of time. And remember when we had the chapter on wills and descent, about inheriting things, we said when you inherit something, it's called a devise. So a devise is when you inherit something. A demise is when you lease something. So those always seem to be together on the test because they're out to fool you. We want to remember a lease is a reversionary interest. So when you have a lease, when the lease ends, when your lease is over, your right of possession goes back to the landlord. So it is a reversionary interest. At the end of the lease, the right of possession goes back to the landlord. During the period of the lease, you have, the tenant has the right of possession during the period of the lease. But what makes it a lease is it's for a definite period of time. It's for a definite period of time, and all you're doing is borrowing the right of possession. Now, we're going to divide the general types of leasehold estates or tenancies into a couple of different ways. But the first one is the main different categories. And we're going to do more than these four because we're going to define them from different perspectives. But these are the first four. Now, I want to warn you that one of them is called an estate for years. That's always confusing on the test because an estate for years is a lease. But when you see the word estate, when you see this word estate, you might think it means it's real property. Well, it doesn't. That word estate just means what level of the bundle of rights you have. And we know that your level of the bundle of rights you have is just the right of possession. Okay? So an estate for years is a type of tenancy. A periodic estate, which is also known as a month-to-month estate, is a type of tenancy. A tenancy at will is a type of tenancy. And a tenancy at sufferance, well, that's not really a tenancy. It's when you don't have the right of tenancy, but you're still in the property. Right? And we're gonna go over those again and kind of get it a little bit better. So I want you to think about this for a second. If you're a landlord and somebody rents your property, you're thinking, when will the tenant move out? Is the tenant moving? What's the tenant thinking about doing? And when you're a tenant, you think, when do I have to move out? When will the landlord end my lease? What's the landlord thinking? And so when we define the different types of leases, we really are trying to answer these questions. So the first type of lease, we said, is an estate for years. And because they're always trying to confuse us, an estate for years has nothing to do with years. An estate for years, the definition is when the landlord and the tenant agree when the lease starts and when the lease ends. So a tenancy for years or an estate for years is if you were to sign a lease on August 1st that said your lease is going from August 1st of 2020 to July 31st of 2021, that would be an estate for years. And there would be no notice required from either side to terminate the lease. There would be no notice required from either side to terminate the lease. The lease would just terminate on July 31st. Because if the landlord doesn't know when the lease terminates, he doesn't know when to try to re-advertise the property. If the tenant doesn't know when the lease terminates, the tenant doesn't know when they have to move out or when they might have to start looking for a new apartment. So in an estate for years, it's clear from the beginning when it begins and when it ends. It's clear from the beginning when it begins and when it ends. That's what makes it an estate for years. And an estate for years doesn't have to be for years. We might have it where you're signing a lease beginning August 1st of 2020 and ending December 31st of 2020. That's still an estate for years because both the landlord and the tenant still know when it starts and they know when it ends. And since they know when it starts and when it ends, there's no notice required to terminate the lease. So that is the essential characteristic of an estate for years. No notice required to terminate the lease. Why? Because you both know when it starts and you both know when it ends. Now, the next kind of a lease is a little different. It's a periodic tenancy or a month-to-month tenancy. In a periodic tenancy or a month-to-month tenancy, every time you pay the same amount of money, you get the same amount of time. So I pay you $1,000, I get a month. I pay you $1,000, I get a month. I pay you $1,000, I get a month. That's a month-to-month or a periodic tenancy. The danger with that kind of a tenancy is, how does the landlord know if you're thinking of moving out? Or how do you know that the landlord is not going to renew your lease? Therefore, in a periodic tenancy or a periodic estate or a month-to-month tenancy, there's 30 days notice required from either side to terminate the lease. So if I give you $1,000 and I get a month, and then I give you $1,000 and I get a month, if I want to terminate, I have to give you 30 days notice. So for an actual kind of example, if I had given you $1,000 July 1st, live there for July, if I was not going to stay there, I would have to give you notice before August 1st in order for me to be out by the end of August, because I have to give you 30 days notice. So if I was intending to kick you out the end of August, I would have to give you notice before the 1st of August. I would have to give you notice the last day of July, okay, because there's 30 days notice to terminate the lease. The landlord wants to terminate, 30 days notice. If the tenant wants to terminate, 30 days notice. Now you might have a month-to-month or a periodic tenancy. You might have a month-to-month or a periodic tenancy that's not a month. I have a friend who has a boarding house in Perth Amboy, and he charges people $75 a week for a room. So he has a month-to-month tenancy, but they're really only paying $75 every week. It's still a month-to-month or a periodic tenancy. And he still has the obligation to give them at least 30 days notice to terminate the lease. Even though they pay by the week, they pay 75, they get a week. They pay 75, they get a week. Either side still has to give 30 days notice to terminate because it's a periodic tenancy or a month-to-month. The only difference in a periodic tenancy and a month-to-month is if your period of time is year to year. If your period of time is year to year, then you have to give 90 days notice. So if you have a lease, and I have somebody who's offering to pay a whole year, they don't have good credit, so they're offering to pay a whole year's rent in advance. That's still going to be a periodic tenancy because they paid for a whole year, but now they would have to get 90 days notice in the event the landlord wasn't going to renew the lease at the end of that year. And the tenant would have to give the landlord 90 days notice if they were going to move out at the end of the year. But unless it's a period of time that's a year or more, if it's a week, if it's a month, if it's a quarter, there's 30 days notice on either side to terminate the lease. That's a month-to-month lease or a periodic lease. The next kind of a lease is a lease that we use for special occasions, and it's a tenancy at will. A tenancy at will ends upon the sale of the house, the death of the landlord, or the death of the tenant. So a tenancy at will ends at the sale of the house, the death of the landlord, or the death of the tenant. Now, if you're renting with a tenancy at will and the landlord doesn't sell and the landlord doesn't die and you don't die and you want to move out, then you have to give 90 days notice. You have to give 90 days notice. So again, in a tenancy at will, it automatically ends on the sale of the house. It automatically ends on the death of the landlord. It automatically ends on the death of the tenant. But if none of those happens and you want to end it, either side wants to end it, there needs to be 90 days notice. So when would you use a tenancy at will? Well, if you're selling your house and you think that whoever's buying it doesn't want the tenant in there, you might give the guy who's living there now a tenancy at will. And that tenancy at will then would end upon the sale of the house. So if you got the house sold, you could easily evict them, easily get them out because their lease ends upon the sale of the house if they have a tenancy at will. And a tenancy at will is a specific type of tenancy that ends upon those circumstances. A tenancy at will ends on the sale of the house, the death of the landlord, the death of the tenant. If none of those happens and one of the parties wants to terminate, there needs to be a 90-day notice. The next kind, and remember I said it's really not a tenancy at all, and that's a tenancy at suffrage. A tenancy at suffrage is also called a holdover tenancy. A tenancy at suffrage is also called a holdover tenancy. Now, let's see, we got a question here. Let's answer the question. Can there be other stipulations that a month-to-month landlord can terminate immediately? So you're asking a question that's above my pay grade, but again, you have an A through Q criteria in the end of the chapter that tells you what are the grounds for eviction. But the tenant has a medical emergency and the landlord finds out the tenant was hoarding. You'd have to be very careful with hoarding because remember, mental disability is a protected class. So if you discriminate against somebody because they have hoarding as a psychological disorder, you might be guilty of violating the Federal Fair Housing Act. And you know, people who are really bad hoarders could have a psychological condition. So the rest of the question is, can there be stipulations that a month-to-month landlord can terminate immediately? No. For example, the tenant is paid for the month, but that the tenant has a medical emergency and the landlord finds out the tenant was hoarding. Does that give the landlord the right to terminate immediately? No, it doesn't. And here's what would have to happen. If you felt that the hoarding was causing an unsafe condition for other tenants or for other occupants in the building, you would send a cease and desist letter that would give the tenant the opportunity to correct the deficiency before you could apply those A through Q criteria. Okay? So this is one of those questions. If somebody asked me this in real life, I would say talk to your attorney. Please be careful because hoarding could be a psychological condition and that would make them mentally handicapped. And then if you discriminated against them because of a symptom of their mental handicap, you might be guilty of violating the Federal Fair Housing Act. So Nancy asked the question, when do they do this tenancy at will with the tenant? So you would do this tenancy at will with a tenant, and I'm going to go back to that for a second. You would do this tenancy at will with the tenant when you sign a lease. In the lease, you would put this as a tenancy at will, or this is a periodic tenancy, or this is a tenancy for years. And you don't necessarily have to put that this is a tenancy at will, but you would put in a tenancy at will that the tenancy would terminate upon the death of the landlord, the sale of the property, or the death of the tenant. You would actually enter that into the lease itself. Janice has raised your hand. If you have a question, you can unmute yourself and ask it, or you can put it in the chat feature.
Hi, Bruce. Yeah, you referred to under tenancy at sufferance, also known as a holdover tenancy, but in the book, the term holdover tenancy is referred under estate for years.
Well, so let me explain how that works. So if we're looking at tenancy at suffrage, a tenancy at suffrage arises when a tenant comes into possession of a property lawfully, then wrongfully remains in possession after his lease has expired without the consent of the landlord. Since there is no notice requirement to terminate such a tenancy, the landlord may re-enter into possession and have the tenant evicted, or the landlord may elect to accept the tenant for similar terms and conditions as stipulated in the prior lease. If the landlord accepts rent from the tenant after expiration of the lease, the tenant becomes a statutory month-to-month. So a holdover tenant is the same thing as a tenancy at suffrage. Where did you see a verbiage to the opposite? Oh, here it is. If the tenant remains on the property with the landlord's consent after the expiration of his lease, all the terms and conditions of the original lease can be continued during his holdover tenancy. So what that means, you have an estate for years. Let's go back to an estate for years. That means the landlord and the tenant agree when the lease starts and when the lease ends. And so you had an estate for years, and we're going to say that the estate for years had a begin date of 7/1/2019, and it ended, because it's an estate for years, we would say when it's going to end, it ended 7/1/2020. So now at the end, again, there's no notice required to end an estate for years, because you agreed it was going to end on 7/1/2020.
Your Chromebook that updates automatically. Switch to updates without interruption.
Sorry about that. Okay, so you had a lease from 7/1/2019 to 7/1/2020. Because it was an estate for years, there's no notice required. The landlord expected the tenant to leave on 7/1/2020, but the tenant didn't leave. So on 7/2/2020, the landlord goes to the property to see what's going on, and the tenant is still in there. At that point, the tenant is a holdover tenant, which means he is in the property, but his right of possession is left, because his right of possession went back to the landlord as of 7/1/2020. So now the tenant on 7/2/2020 is in possession. He's in the property, living in it, but without the right of possession. And so being there without the right of possession makes you a holdover tenant or a tenant at suffrage. And so again, it says, if the tenant remains on the property with the landlord's consent after the expiration of his lease, all the terms and conditions of the original lease can be continued during his holdover tenancy. In a residential leasehold situation, in the absence of any agreement to the contrary, when the landlord accepts the rent in advance after the first month of a holdover tenancy, it creates a month-to-month. So what it's saying is 7/1/2019 it started, 7/1/2020 is when it was supposed to end. There was no notice required because it's an estate for years, but the tenant did not move out. So for right now, for this one day, we have a holdover tenant because that tenant no longer has the right of possession. And if you decide you're going to go ahead and move to get him evicted, he becomes a tenant at suffrage. If you accept, you're the landlord, and you go knock on his door and he hands you out his rent, his $1,000, and you accept it, at that point, if you look at the very last, on the left-hand side on 365, when the landlord accepts rent after the first month of a holdover tenancy, it creates a month-to-month. So on 7/2/20, when the landlord knocked on the door and said, how come you haven't left yet? And then the tenant says, oh, I didn't find a place. Here's my rent, $1,000. Well, now when the landlord accepts the rent, the tenant becomes a periodic tenant or a month-to-month. The tenant is not a tenant with an estate for years because the landlord and the tenant don't know when it's supposed to end. So when the landlord accepts the $1,000, he goes from being a holdover tenant to a month-to-month tenant. Same thing happens. Your lease is supposed to end on 7/1/2020. The landlord comes to the apartment on 7/2/2020, and you, the tenant, open the door and hand the landlord $1,000, and the landlord says, nope, I'm not taking any money from you. Now you are a tenant at suffrage. Now you are in the unit without the right of possession, and that's where the landlord can go ahead and have you evicted. So I hope that made it clear. And again, when you're a landlord, if you want the tenant out of there at the end of that estate for years and he hands you $1,000, don't take it, because he becomes a month-to-month tenant. And as a month-to-month tenant, how much notice is required to terminate his lease? 30 days. So that means if you take the $1,000 for July, on July 1st, if you take that $1,000, you can't get him out anytime sooner than the end of August, because he's paid his rent for July, and you have to give him 30 days notice to terminate a month to month. Okay, so I hope that made it clear. And you know, it kind of that they should have put holdover tenant kind of with the arrow to the tenant at suffrage. All right, and this is a common situation. Now, if you rent an apartment building, right? If you rent an apartment building, you are typically in an estate for years, because you have a beginning and an end to your lease. And if you're renting an apartment building, the management company will typically send you a new lease, sometime before the end of your old lease, and ask you to sign it. So now when you sign the new lease, it's going to have a new ending date. But because you both agreed when it begins and when it ends, it's going to be an estate for years. If they forget to send you a new lease and your estate runs out, your lease runs out, and then they show up the day after your lease runs out and you hand them your rent, now you become a periodic tenant and you need to have 30 days notice to terminate the lease. Okay. So let's go back to a tenant at suffrage again. A tenant at suffrage is a tenant who is in the property and he has no right of possession. Right of possession not held by the tenant, but tenant is still in the building. And if you are a holdover tenant, the landlord has to go through the process of evicting you. They do not allow self-help evictions in New Jersey. They do not allow self-help evictions in New Jersey. So if you happen to be a landlord and you've never been to landlord-tenant court before, I recommend you go to landlord-tenant court and sit in and watch how it works. You're going to be amazed, and you're also going to get sick if you're a landlord, because they make it very hard. They make it very hard on the landlords, and they always push for you to have what they call the stipulated settlement. But we'll talk about that later on in the chapter. All right, the next kind of leases we're going to talk about is commercial leases. Commercial leases, and then we have ground leases, net leases, gross leases, percentage leases, reappraisal leases, and oil and gas leases. So a ground lease. Now, I used to tell everybody to look out the window, and across where the Walmart is, across from my school, that Walmart is a ground lease. That's where the owner of the land, where that Walmart is, didn't sell the land. He simply did a ground lease. So he leased the land to Walmart. Walmart builds their building. Okay? Now, if you've ever been to Manhattan and looked at Macy's, it's a beautiful building with all kinds of architectural detail. If you look at this Walmart building, it's a shell made out of steel and concrete. So it's not beautiful. It's not meant to last forever. And the reason it's not meant to last forever is they are only leasing the land, but Walmart has built their own building. So the landlord rents the land, the tenants build their own building, and at the end of the lease, the tenant is responsible to remove the building. So of course, Walmart is not going to build a beautiful building, because if they have a 50-year lease, at the end of 50 years, they're going to have to tear the building down and take it away. Sometimes when you have this kind of a ground lease, and the Walmart across the street from my office is a great example, it has a step-up or a graduated lease. For right now, the Walmart across the street, there's nothing else in the giant parking lot. But if you look over to the left of the parking lot, you're going to see all these hookups already getting in place for sewer and water and electric. That's because at some point, they're going to lease out this space and they'll build more buildings back over here. And as they build these more buildings back over here, their lease might go up. It might step up or be graduated to a higher level. So when you have a ground lease, you might have a step up or a graduated lease. And again, with a ground lease, at the end of the lease, the tenant who is renting the land but they built their own building, is responsible for removing their building. Okay? The next kind of a lease is a net lease. So on a net lease, and that's the way most commercial leases are, you have a flat fee plus you pay your share of the taxes. So if somebody says, I have a net lease, that means it's $1,000 a month, plus the tenant pays their taxes, whatever the real estate taxes are. You might have what's called a triple net lease. In a triple net lease, it'll be a flat fee, plus you'll pay the taxes, plus you'll pay common area charges, plus you'll pay insurance. You might have just a double net lease. In a double net lease, you might just have taxes and common area charges. And again, if you just have a plain old-fashioned net lease, if you have just a plain old-fashioned net lease, you're going to pay a flat fee plus your share of the taxes. And that's the way most commercial leases are. They're net leases. The next kind of a lease is a gross lease. And I used to joke that if you were taking class in person, you knew that the bathrooms at the school were really gross. And I have a gross lease at the school. I just make one payment and it covers everything. I don't have to pay for part of the taxes. I don't have to pay for snowplow. I don't have to pay for the common area upkeep. I don't have to pay for cleaning the bathrooms, which are really gross. So I have a gross lease. Just one payment covers everything. And normally, you know, these are commercial leases, but if we were looking at a residential lease is usually a form of a gross lease, right? When you have a residential lease, you're just paying one flat fee. You're not paying the taxes. Again, if you have a net lease, you're paying a flat fee plus a share of the taxes. The next kind of a lease is a percentage lease. And a percentage lease is a lease where you pay a flat fee and a percentage of the sales. Now, let's think about a mall. In a mall, you have the two big anchors or the three big anchors, JCPenney at one end, Nordstrom's at the other. Those guys usually are having a land lease or they're having a net lease, those big guys, okay? And then all the little guys that are up and down the corridors of the mall, these little guys, they all benefit from the big stores. They all benefit from the way the big stores draw in customers. That's called the principle of attraction. That's why the big stores are called the magnet stores. So the little stores that are along the hallways, they typically pay a flat fee plus a percentage of their sales. So they pay perhaps $1,000 a month plus 5% of all sales. Now, this whole situation is in flux right now. And the reason it's in flux right now is the way stores do business has really changed. Many times stores are just a showroom for things to order online. And so, again, a lot of these leases are having to be renegotiated because how does the landlord charge for the internet sales? Usually this means 5% of the sales in the store. So how does the landlord charge for internet sales? However, on the test, you may have a question that says, a landlord pays $1,000 a month plus 5% of all sales. If last month the rent was $2,000, how much did they sell? So the first $1,000 is the flat fee. The second $1,000 represents 5% of sales. So what were sales? So what number, where 5% of that number gives you 1,000, we take 1,000, we divide it by 0.05, and we get $20,000. So what we can see is the little stores had $20,000 in sales. So therefore, since they had $20,000 in sales, they had to pay 5% on that $20,000. And that 5% on the $20,000 amounted to $1,000. And so that $1,000 added to their flat fee of $1,000 gives them their $2,000 rent. That's a very common question on the test. And again, remember the JCPenney's and the Nordstroms, they are called the magnet stores. I'm sure you've heard that term. And the reason they're the magnet stores is they attract all the clients who shop in these. And these guys then, they pay $1,000 a month plus 5% of all sales, so that the more they sell, The more they sell, the more their revenues go up, the more the landlord gets in rent. And many of these types of leases have a flat fee, not a flat fee, a minimum fee, where, for instance, if you don't make that $20,000 in sales, you maybe only make $10,000. You might still have to pay the full $2,000 because they also have floors where the minimum rent has to be a certain amount. And again, this is stuff that's really under negotiation with all these tenants right now because people are not buying so much stuff in the stores anymore. They're buying stuff, they're trying it on in the stores and they're looking at the stuff in the stores, but they're buying it off of Amazon or off of the websites. All right, we also have oil and gas leases. If you've ever been to Los Angeles, you'll see all the oil wells around pumping oil out by the La Brea tar pits area where there's a large pool of oil underneath there. People rent out the rights to their oil or their natural gas, and companies put a will on there and they pull out the oil. In Pennsylvania, a lot of farmers rent out their farms for fracking, and when they do the fracking, they extract natural gas. The farmer doesn't sell his land. He just leases out the oil and gas rights underneath his land, And if you watch, by the way, that show about the people who are always searching for gold in Alaska, those guys are leasing the rights to the gold. So they're having mineral rights. They're just leasing the mineral rights to the gold as they search for their gold. They're not buying the pieces of property in Alaska. Look, leases also have escalator clauses. And an escalator clause is something that would adjust upwards in times of inflation. And that adjustment upwards would be attached to some kind of an index. Could be the consumer price index, could be the cost of funds index, it could be the London Interbank Offering Rate Index, could be 6-month Treasury Auction Index. But what it does is it protects the landlord against inflation. And when we do the chapter on Thursday night about appraisal, and we look at the value of a property by income, so the value by income is equal to the net operating income divided by the cap rate. If your expenses go up, and at the same time when your expenses go up, you don't bring your rent up to match it, the value of your building goes down because it would cause your NOI to go down, your net operating income. If your expenses go up, but your rent doesn't go up, then your NOI goes down. And if your NOI goes down, your net operating income goes down, the value of your building goes down. And we'll see that tomorrow night, again, because value by income is equal to NOI divided by cap rate. And we'll see that tomorrow night in the chapter on appraisals. So value by income is equal to NOI divided by cap rate. So if your NOI goes down because your expenses went up, your value goes down, okay? So you'd have an escalator clause to protect against that. You would have an escalator clause to protect against that. Now, how would you create a lease? Well, there's a couple of ways. You can do it by an express bilateral agreement. You could do it by performance. I hand you the keys, you hand me the rent, you move in. That's by performance we've made a lease. The best way is with a lease. And a lease should have a date, although it doesn't have to, because you might hand me the money at the same time I hand you the keys and we sign an agreement. The lease should have, both parties need to have the contractual ability to sign. So in other words, only the landlord can sign, and you're the tenant, you can sign. You're not making a deal with somebody who has no ownership in the building. So you have to have the contractual ability of the parties, 18 sane and sober also. There needs to be mutual agreement with consideration. A mutual agreement is that you both agree to the terms of the lease. Consideration means something of value has got to change hands. What changes hands in a lease? Well, what changes hands is the rent or the right of possession. So something of value has to change hands. There needs to be a description of the property. It should have a use of the premises and what's allowed to be, the lease allows you to do in the property. I showed a small office building, a small office unit today in Highland Park The rent is $1,700 a month, and the landlord will not allow any kind of dance studio because he has an agreement with other tenants in the building that he won't allow any other dance studios. So he has a use of the premises as for no dance studio. Can't be for dance studio. A lease has to be for a legal purpose. So if you sign a lease in order to have a meth factory to make crystal meth, that lease is not a valid lease because it's not for a legal purpose. A lease should have signatures of the parties. If you have a written lease, you have a written express bilateral lease, you should have signatures of the parties. And then you might want to record a lease. Especially in commercial transactions, you probably do want to record a lease. And if you do record a lease, in order to record it, it has to be accompanied with an acknowledgement. In order to record a lease, it has to be accompanied with an acknowledgement. So those are the ways that we create a lease. And now we're going to talk about the ways we terminate a lease. One way is expiration of term. So you signed a lease from 7/1 of 2019 to 7/1 of 2020. 7/2/2020, it expires. It's the length of the lease. That's the expiration of term. The next method is surrender. Surrender is when the landlord and the tenant both agree that the lease is over. So, you know, we have my son's restaurant in New Brunswick, one of his restaurants in New Brunswick, closed down. There's no place for them to set up outside dining. So they're not going to continue in operation. So they go to the landlord and they say, listen, I can't do this anymore. Would you let me out of my lease? And the landlord says, well, there's no way that you're going to be able to continue. So I'll agree to allow you out of your lease. That's a surrender. And when you do a surrender, my son is no longer responsible for the remaining 5 years on the lease because they agreed to a surrender. So he's no longer responsible for the remaining 5 years on the lease. Breach of conditions mean the conditions have gotten so bad that you cannot continue, or it means that the tenant is not paying. So breach of conditions, or the tenant has a dog where they promised not to have a dog. Those are breach of conditions. Then we have actual eviction and constructive eviction. That terminates a lease. An actual eviction is when you go through the process of suing for possession as the landlord. You get a judgment for possession as the landlord. After a statutory period to allow the tenant to cure, you go and you file for your actual eviction, and then a court officer will come and you'll evict the tenant. Okay? That's an actual eviction. You have to go through the whole process. And if you are evicted as a tenant, you are not responsible for the balance of your lease. We also have constructive evictions. Constructive evictions is when the health or safety of the property gets to a degree that it's no longer helpful or safe to be in it. Then the tenant can claim constructive eviction, and they have to move out. That's the key to constructive eviction. You have to move out. And for instance, if your building has no heat, you can't stay in there over the winter. If you want to end your lease because it has no heat and claim constructive eviction, you have to move out. Now, there are going to be a whole lot of constructive eviction cases because if Governor Murphy says your gym, your health club, your gym can't be used because it's unhealthy, and you move out, will that give you the opportunity to have a constructive eviction? And the question about having a constructive eviction is if you have a constructive eviction, you are relieved of your obligation to pay the balance of the lease. So if you have a gym and Governor Murphy says it's unsafe to have the gym open and you claim constructive eviction and you move out, the landlord will not be able to, in theory, sue you for the balance of the lease. So that's constructive eviction. We'll see. Those cases are all going to hit the courts. The next thing is prior right. Prior right comes into account when somebody with a prior right, with priority, takes the property back. So for instance, if you were renting a property and you have a pure attribute estate, your lease, you lease from somebody who has a pure attribute estate, and the person against whose life that estate is measured dies, well, even though you signed a lease with the person who had the present interest, your lease ends when the pure attribute person dies. So that would terminate your lease. That's not that common. The more common thing with prior right is normally when you go to rent an apartment or rent a house, you're not even thinking about the mortgage that the landlord gave to the bank to buy the house. But when the landlord gave the mortgage to the bank to buy the house, and it got to the bank recorded it, and that established time and date. That established priority. The bank recorded it. So somebody bought a house 10 years ago, and it was recorded 10 years ago. The lien for the mortgage was recorded 10 years ago. And now you're living in the house, and you just signed your lease last year, but the mortgage was signed 10 years ago by the landlord. But you just signed your lease last year, and the house gets foreclosed. The lender had prior right because the lender's mortgage lien was recorded prior to your lease. Therefore, when a house gets foreclosed, the lease of the tenant is terminated. And that really stinks, because if you're a tenant and you've been paying your rent all along, but your landlord is a creep and he hasn't been paying his mortgage all along, when he gets foreclosed, you get kicked out of the property because prior right can terminate a lease. Another way, excuse me, another way to terminate a lease is destruction of the premises. So the property is destroyed, it terminates the lease. And the last way is abandonment. Abandonment is when you're gone, all your furniture is gone, and you have no intention of ever returning. That terminates the lease. But I have been sued when I got an apartment that looked like this, and I reported to the bank that the tenant had left, that he had abandoned. And the bank went in there and they changed the locks and they did some stuff, and the tenant came back and he said, I never abandoned this, I just wasn't in it, and I just didn't have any furniture. And that's because we didn't make sure that that tenant had the intention to never come back. Therefore, it might not be abandonment. Okay? So abandonment means the tenant has left and has no intention of coming back. Now, on abandonment, the tenant is still responsible for the balance of the lease. The tenant is still going to be responsible for the monthly payments on the balance of the lease.
Hey, Bruce.
Yes.
You can also see the apartment is abandoned. Also, the person has not been paid the rent. If he's not been paid the rent, no matter what he say, I don't think he has the right to occupy the apartment.
Not necessarily, because until you've gone to court for a right of possession, he still has the tenant still has the right of possession. Because until you go to court and take that right of possession away with a suit for possession, he still has possession. So not necessarily. You got to be careful about that. We quite often, in Fannie Mae foreclosures, we quite often will have a property that the tenant's been gone for years, but they left all their furniture there. They've been gone for years. We still have to go for a personal property eviction. We have to go and evict the personal property, even though it's covered with mouse droppings and it's covered with dust and it's been there for years. Fannie Mae's limit is if it has more than $500 worth of garage sale value, they have to do, and that's Fannie Mae's rule, that's not a law. Fannie Mae says if it has more than $500 of garage sale value, then they have to do a personal property eviction. So we often evict personal property. And
Bruce,
yeah.
but also, I think that even if, let's say, a person has an apartment for a certain amount of time and they have it on the lease that amount of time, even if they abandoned, let's say, paying the rent, they still are, they still didn't abandon the property because they have a lease for a certain amount of time.
Still have their lease. So until you go to court for a suit for possession, also known as a dispossess action, also known as a suit for summary possession, all those things are when you, the landlord, are going to the court and you're saying to the court, please, here's all the circumstances, please give me back the right of possession. Please tell me that the tenant no longer has the right of possession. And that's exactly what it is. So, you know, a lot of the stuff that everybody wonders, how'd that go on? What happened here? Now it's kind of becoming clear. Now, in this abandonment issue, remember, we're pretending that the tenant left after 3 months here in abandonment, and he still has 9 months to go on his lease. He owes those 9 months, right? The landlord could sue him for those 9 months on abandonment. However, the landlord has an obligation to try to re-rent the property as soon as possible. He has an obligation to re-rent as soon as possible. And his right is to mitigate the damages to the tenant. It's not his right, his obligation is to mitigate the damages. So he wants to try to rent it as quickly as he can so he can start getting rent, so he doesn't have to sue the tenant for anything except this section here. He can get it rented right away. He doesn't have the right to sue the tenant for this section here. So he has a right to mitigate, an obligation to mitigate the damages. Okay, now, what's the largest lawsuit for destruction of the premises terminating a lease in history? What's the largest lawsuit?
9/11.
That's exactly right. One man, Mr. Silverstein, had leases. He had leases to one of the World Trade Center buildings. He had signed a lease, and he was subleasing all of the units in one of the World Trade Center buildings. And when that World Trade Center came down, the destruction of the premises terminated the leases. And that court case was just settled a year ago from 9/11. Because imagine how much that was worth, having the opportunity to sublease all of the units in one of the World Trade Center towers. So destruction of the premises terminates a lease. Now, I had a lawsuit one time where I had a building in South Amboy that burned down. And when the building burned down, I got a very good insurance settlement. And my original intention was to rebuild the building much better than before. And the tenant who was in there sued me and said he has the right to have his lease back on the new building because he had a lease there before. When I build a new building, I have to lease it back to him. And we went to court over that. And what the judge found was that the building had been totally destroyed, and it had, and they even made me bulldoze it and fill up the foundation. South Amboy did. And so that destruction of the premises terminated the lease. So he didn't have any rights in the new building. All right. Now we're to the, let's go back here. We want to talk about leases in terms of a lease itself. We're going to talk about assignment, and subleasing. Get these up out of the way. So when you have a lease for a period of time, right? And today, the house I showed in New Brunswick, the rental I showed, they had a lease. The people had a lease, and they had a lease. They had signed a lease from in New Brunswick. The rental period for Rutgers Rentals is from 6/1 of 2020 to 5/30 of 2021. That's the normal rental season at Rutgers. You go from 6/1 of 2020 to 5/30 of 2021. Right? So what happened was the people who signed the lease, they're gone now. They're gone. And they're going to come back in September. But for the period of the summer, they sublease the property to other people from Rutgers because people who originally signed the lease, they had the obligation to pay for the whole year, but they were not going to be here for this period in here. They were not going to be here for this period in here. So they let other people come in and pay the rent. And that's a sublease. As long as the original person who signed the lease, as long as they're going to come back into possession before the end of the lease, which they are, they're going to come back into possession of the lease on September 1st, and this guy is going to move out, that's a sublease. As long as they come back into possession before the end of the original lease, that's a sublease. Sometimes it's called a sandwich lease because sometimes you've got a property that's got this kind of a tenancy and you're going to move out here and sublease to your sublessee here. And they call that a sandwich lease because here's the bread, and this is the meat. Okay? So you're sandwiched between two
Hey,
other.
bro,
Yeah.
sorry, but in the sublease, who gets like sublease? Who pays who? So the original leasee pay the landlord, but then also the sublease people also pay the landlord, or they pay the original leasee?
So it can be either way. It can be either way. If the landlord allows them to sublease, the new tenant can pay directly, or the new tenant can pay the original tenant who is now the sublessor, and he can then pay the landlord. But the more important thing is here's the guy who signed the original lease, and here's the person who's subleasing. Typically, the landlord makes them both be responsible for the rent, so that if they don't pay, he can sue either of them. So typically, he'll make them both be responsible for the rent.
So he will get paid like twice?
No.
The same place?
What will happen is if this guy doesn't pay while he's subleasing, the landlord will sue him for the money and sue him for the money. He won't get double money, but he'll get money from both of them.
Okay.
And that's a good question because now we're going to go to assigning a lease. When you assign a lease, again, here's the guy who signed the original lease, and you're going to assign a lease. That means he's only going to stay in it till here. This is his period here. And then he's going to assign the lease to this guy, and this guy is going to stay to the end. What makes it different than a sublease is the person to whom you assigned it is going to stay until the end. You're not going to come back into possession again. And now the question is, here's the landlord. So the landlord's expecting pay from him, and now he's going to assign it to him. The landlord is not going to release him from his obligation under the lease necessarily. So that in the event this guy doesn't pay, now the landlord could sue him and or sue him. Now, sometimes the landlord will agree to release this one from the lease. And just like we talked about when you assign the note, he would do that with a novation. He would create a new agreement that released the original guy from the note. So now only this guy would be responsible to pay. Okay? Many leases say no assignment. Many leases say no assignment without written permission from the landlord. Many leases say no subleasing. No subleasing without written permission from the landlord. Okay? So let's talk for a minute about security deposits. Security deposits can only be 1.5 times the rent. A landlord has to put a security deposit into a landlord-tenants account. Is a sublease and a sublet the same thing? Yes. Good question, but yes. Okay. So when you rent an apartment, the landlord has to put the security deposit into a landlord-tenant account under the tenant's social security number with the interest being paid to the tenant. And the interest is minuscule. It might be 0.5% being paid to the tenant. When the tenant turns over that security deposit to the landlord at the beginning of the lease, the landlord has 30 days to let the tenant know where that money is being held. And if the landlord does not let the tenant know where that money is being held, then the tenant can say to the landlord, just use my security deposit for next month's rent. At the end of the lease, the landlord has 30 days to give the tenant back their security deposit or to give them a written explanation of why they didn't give it back. And if the landlord chooses not to give the security deposit back and not to give the tenant a written explanation of why he didn't give it back, the tenant can actually sue for 3 times damages. So if the security deposit is $2,000, the tenant can sue for $6,000. So it's very important to get that security deposit. And this security deposit only applies to residential. On commercial, the security deposit can be anything. Where you're going to keep the security deposit is all part of the lease and the agreement. How soon you have to give it back, it's all part of the lease and the agreement.
Hey, Bruce.
Yep.
Some of the car dealers are doing the same thing right now too.
Which is?
A security deposit when you lease a car.
Oh, sure.
At the end of the lease, they will give you the security deposit back.
I don't know what rules protect you, but I know in real estate, if a tenant in a residential property gives you a security deposit, you have to put it in a landlord-tenant account, tell the tenant where it is within 30 days, and if you don't tell them, the tenant has the right to use it for its rent. Now, as we get to page 370, 371, this is the law itself. Some of the things, you might want to, if you're a landlord, you might want to read through all this stuff. Like on page 373 is the right of entry. When does a landlord have the right to come into an apartment? So, in the question earlier, you have a tenant who had a medical emergency and you needed to go into his apartment to see why it smelled. You have the right to go into the apartment. And then, again, you wouldn't be able to kick him out because they're hoarding and it's full of rats and stuff. You wouldn't be able to just lock the door. That's called a self-help eviction, and that's illegal in New Jersey. But what you would be able to do is to send a cease and desist letter, and then you would be able to go to court for a suit for possession. Because in order to evict somebody, you have to go through that lawsuit for possession. You have to ask the judge to decide who is going to have the right of possession. Senior citizens can't be charged a late fee until after the 5th day because they might have their Social Security late. So you can't make a senior citizen's rent late on the 3rd or 4th day. It can't be late until after the 5th day. Some towns have rent control. The property I showed in New Brunswick, the rental I showed in New Brunswick tonight has rent control. The landlord cannot raise the rent above a certain amount of money. In New Brunswick, this year they allowed the landlords to raise the rent 2.8%. That's not very much. In between tenants, you have to have a carbon monoxide and smoke detector inspection in New Jersey. All apartments have to have lockable front and rear doors. Many towns do not allow you to have lockable doors on bedrooms, but the front door, the entranceway doors have to be lockable. If you have a property that's above the first floor, a tenant who has a child, I forget what the age is, 10 years of age or younger, can request you put window guards on, and you have to put window guards on. There is a requirement by the state about the temperature you have to keep a building. If you provide heat and the dates that you have to provide that temperature, you'll find that all in this stuff in this Truth in Renting Act. Lead-based paint. Again, if you know that you have lead-based paint, you have to notify the tenant. On page 382, it talks about not being able to do self-help evictions. And again, on page 382, it starts the A through Q criteria for evicting a tenant. A being the tenant fails to pay the rent. B being the tenant continues disorderly conduct. C being the tenant causes destruction or damage. So your person that's a hoarder, that is probably the one that you would want to use to do the eviction. D is a tenant continues to violate any reasonable rules and regulations. E is a tenant continues a substantial breach of any reasonable covenant or agreement. Like they have a dog when the lease says no dogs. E, a tenant of public housing continues to substantially violate any of the breach of covenants or agreements. F, if a tenant fails to pay a rent increase after a valid notice of increase. And there's some extra verbiage in there about when that doesn't apply. G, a landlord who has been cited for violations of local or state codes and he wants to permanently board up or demolish the building. That's the reason to evict people. a landlord who has been cited for violations of local or state codes and it's not feasible to fix everything with the tenant in the building. I've used that one. I've used that with a building in Perth Amboy, that the tenants didn't want to leave and they kept paying their rent, but I needed to get them out to repair all the violations that Perth Amboy wrote. So I had to use that one in order to get a tenant out. Number G is a landlord who has been cited for violation of local or state code seeks to correct an illegal occupancy. In New Brunswick, I've had that happen. In New Brunswick, when you rent out an apartment, they tell you exactly how many people can live in it. So you come back in 3 weeks, and instead of being 5 people in it, there's 12. Well, if now you give a notice, a notice to quit to the tenant, and if they don't get rid of some of the people, then you can file to have them evicted for illegal occupancy. A landlord who was or owner of a governmental agency that wants to remove the property from the rental market and carry out a redevelopment plan. An owner who is permanently removing a building or mobile home park from residential use. So if you're going to permanently stop renting it, maybe use it for yourself. A landlord or owner who at the termination of a lease proposes change to a lease that are not favorable to the tenant refuses to sign. That's reason. One of my favorite ones is number J, and that is a tenant who is habitually late. I have evicted people before for being habitually late. Being habitually late is a pain because your mortgage payment is due if you mortgage the building, but also it's hard to keep track if somebody is late and they're paying in dribs and drabs. A landlord or owner of a building is converting from the rental market to a condominium, and there are some protections in that for senior citizens. That happens a lot in New York. They have a rental apartment building and they're converting it to co-ops or condominiums. An owner of a building or a mobile home is constructed or being converted to a condominium. An owner of 3 or fewer condominiums that wants to personally occupy the unit or has sold it to a buyer who wants to personally occupy it. So as you're selling rental property, especially as people start buying multifamilies again, that's when you'll remember. Because if the buyer puts in the contract that he's going to personally occupy the property, that gives the ability for the seller of that property to evict the tenant in order for the buyer to buy it. L is an owner of a building with 3 or fewer units wishes to personally occupy it. M is a landlord or continued conditioned tenancy upon the tenant's employment. So if you lease to somebody upon their employment and they lose their job, in other words, you're leasing to them, you have a bar and it has an apartment upstairs and they're working for you and they quit their job and they don't have any other job. And the reason you rented them the apartment was because they worked in the bar. That's reason to terminate their lease. N is the person has been convicted of or pleaded guilty to an offense under the Comprehensive Drug Reform Act, using or possessing drugs. O, the person has been convicted or pleaded guilty to an offense under the law involving assault or terrorist threats. P, the person has been found liable in a civil action for removal commenced under the eviction law for an offense under N. N is the person has been convicted or pleaded guilty to an offense. And P, the person has been found liable in civil action for removal commenced under the eviction. And Q, which is the last one, the person who has been convicted or pleaded guilty to an offense involving theft or property from the landlord. It's a reason to evict people. So again, you might want to keep those in mind if you're at some point becoming a landlord. And this Truth in Renting Act is something that comes to, if you're a tenant, you want to know it so you know what your landlord is doing that he's not allowed to do. And if you're a landlord, you want to know how to deal with your tenants. And tenants, if you're a rental property owner, you will have problems. Sometime you'll have a problem. And I always make people who come to class raise their right hand and swear that if they ever own a rental property, they will always raise the rent. They will always raise the rent. Because one of the biggest mistakes I see with people who have owned rental property is they've had the same tenant in there for 30 years and never raised the rent. Well, what that does is it hurts the value of the building and it hurts your cash flow. So anytime you are allowed to raise the rent, you should raise the rent. All right, that brings us to the next chapter, the chapter on property management. So property management is another line of business you can be in when you have your real estate license. What type of an agent are you when you're a property manager? You're a general agent because you have a broad range of responsibilities over a long period of time. From the chapter on agency, we know that you are a special agent when you're a listing agent or a buyer's agent because you have one responsibility. If you're a listing agent, sell the house. If you're a buyer's agent, help the buyer find a house. But when you're a property manager, your duties and responsibilities might go on for a very long period of time. So a property manager is a general agent. Property manager is a general agent. That's always a question on the test. What are your management objectives? To obtain the highest possible returns for the building and at the same time, protect the capital investment. And sometimes that is actually harder than you can think because you can obtain the highest possible return by never doing any preventive maintenance. Or you can protect the capital investment by doing so many repairs and so many improvements that you don't make any cash flow. So you have to kind of balance these two things at once. You have to balance the long term versus the short term. You have to maintain versus don't spend any extra money. You've got to balance all that stuff so that over the long run, you obtain the highest possible returns while protecting your capital investment. Those are your management objectives. It's a specialized field. Property management, you might be qualifying and investigating tenants' credit. You might be marking space and collecting rents. You might be establishing trust accounts. Remember, only a broker can have a trust account. You might be purchasing supplies and auditing bills. You might be hiring contractors and employees. You might be analyzing depreciation deductions, developing tenant relation policies, maintaining records and reporting to the owner, preparing and executing leases, advertising vacancies, planning alterations and modifications, having knowledge of health and building codes, making sure tenants have security, and preparing an annual budget. And many other things also, but those are the main ones that you might have as your responsibilities as a property manager. So before you can begin work as a property manager, you have to have a property management agreement. And the property management agreement lays out your fiduciary duties and appoints you as the agent. It will also lay out your duties to reports, how often you have to file a report. It lays out your authority for operations and for repairs and what you're going to do on a daily basis, or a monthly basis, or a quarterly basis. Are you an employee? Now, if you are an employee, your property management agreement is going to speak about that if you are an employee. But if you are an employee, remember, you don't need a real estate license to do this. Because if you're an employee and you're paid an hourly fee rather than paid a commission or a percentage of things being leased, you do not need a real estate license. Are you an employee or are you a real estate license? If you're an employee, there's no need to be licensed, but your pay has to be based on an hourly pay, not on success or commission. And you can't handle other people's money. So you can be a property manager as an employee for a big apartment complex, but you can't collect rent or handle other people's money. Because in order to collect rent or handle other people's money, you have to have a fiduciary obligation. And you don't have a fiduciary obligation unless you have an agency relationship. So if you're going to be a property manager and you're going to be it as an agent, you're going to be underneath your broker's license. Property manager is going to be underneath the broker's license. And typically a property manager gets paid a percentage of gross collected rents. Typically a property manager gets paid a percentage of gross collected rents. So these are two famous people who were landlords on TV. This is Mr. Roper from Three's Company, and this is Schneider from One Day at a Time. Mr. Roper was an owner. So as an owner, he can manage his own property. He doesn't need a real estate license. Mr. Roper is an owner. He can collect rent because he's an owner. Schneider, and Mr. Roper does not need a real estate license. Schneider was a superintendent. Schneider got a free apartment for managing all the repairs in the complex that Anne Romano lived in one day at a time. Schneider did not need a real estate license. He wasn't handling money. He wasn't executing leases. He was just being a superintendent. He did not need a real estate license. Some of your duties are communicating with the owner, things like fire, disasters, the coronavirus, tenant requests, tenant's financial status, long-range plans, community changes, inquiries for purchase. If somebody says, hey, you thinking of selling the building? What's going on with eminent domain? Is the municipality or the state thinking of taking your building? Those are all things that the property manager should communicate with the owner. And I'll tell you a really upsetting and strange result of Corona. In New York City, they put a moratorium on rents for certain buildings, so the tenants don't have to pay rents right now. They're going to have to catch up later. And the biggest complaint they had was landlords requesting sexual favors for people not paying rents. So again, those are all the kind of things that you have to be aware of that you shouldn't be doing. You have legal issues. You have Environmental Protection Act. Your building has got to be environmentally sound and sensitive. You have to obey the Federal Fair Housing Act. That means no discrimination. You have to obey IRS codes. If you hire somebody as an employee, you're going to have to pay your employment taxes, and you're going to have to report income to the IRS. And you're going to have to, if you're maintaining a workplace, a boiler room or a workshop, you're going to have to obey the Occupational Safety and Health Act. Those are all things that you might have as legal issues if you are indeed a property manager. You're going to have to prepare financial reports in many cases. That's an income and expense report. How much money is coming in, how much money is going out. A profit and loss report. And again, some of these might be simple, but some of them might be very complicated because of depreciation allowances and other methods of accounting procedures. I'm not an accountant, so I can't really help you much on that. You might have cash flow reports you have to do. You might have to have appraisals that you have done, because after all, sometimes, especially on apartment buildings in Manhattan, the leases are charged by a percentage of the appraisal, and you might be preparing property condition reports on some kind of a continuing basis so that the landlord knows what condition his property is in. Now, I manage maybe 5 or 6 small properties. I don't like to do it because I don't make enough money doing it. The only reason I do it, because I don't make enough money doing it, is when that landlord decides he's going to sell the building. If I've been doing a good job, he's going to use me as his listing agent to sell the building. And if that landlord has been making a lot of money on the building and he decides to buy a new building, he's going to use me to buy the new building. So really, I'm doing my property management as a loss leader. But there are a lot of other people out there who manage a lot of buildings, manage a lot of small strip malls, or who manage commercial buildings or professional buildings. Again, it's just another manner in which you can use your real estate license to make money. Property management has a life cycle. You're going to report, you're going to analyze, you have a budget, you're going to plan, and you're going to track. So you're constantly doing that. And as a property manager, you might be given an assignment that goes all the way from design and development to renting out the apartments and managing. You know, there's a lot of people who go all the way from the beginning, from soup to nuts. Right? And it is a way to make money. Property managers over the long run can make an income. And, you know, again, you can do both property management and listings and sales also, or you can do just property management. It tends to be that people who do property management on a big scale don't really deal with buying and selling. How does a property manager get paid? They get paid as a percentage of gross collected rents. And if you're in property management, this is a very short chapter, very, very short chapter. Sometimes on the chapter, they talk about the professional property management organizations on page 406 and 407. You can be a CPM, a certified property manager. You can belong to BOMA, the Building Owners and Managers Association, the National Association of Home Builders. You can be a registered apartment manager, the National Apartment Association, or a certified apartment manager. Now, the reason I bring that up is because if you go to the end of the chapter here on property management, there's only 8 key words. So there's not very many key words in this chapter. It's not a big chapter. And every time there's a chapter, they like to have some kind of a question to ask you on the chapter. All right, so that's property management. Now we're going to skip to chapter 26 because I think this one flows a little bit better. And the next chapter is appraising, by the way, which we're going to do, on the shortened class. Actually, the next one is real estate taxes. Taxes we will do in one class also.
Hey, Bruce.
Yeah.
Is there still a class tomorrow? I just want to confirm.
There's going to be a 7:30 class, just an hour class, and it's going to be on appraising.
7:30. Okay, got you. Thank you.
All right. So we're skipping to chapter 26 now, and that is the chapter that is on business opportunities. There's some weird stuff going to go on now because of Corona and because of people say that we're going to put all small businesses out of business, and all that's going to be left is the giant businesses, and it'll take a while for small businesses to come back. We know that 40% of all restaurants, somewhere around there, are going to close. I have a list of 1,500 restaurants on a spreadsheet. I've been emailing all of them to find out if they want to, if the landlords want to sell the buildings, because so many businesses are going to go out of, so many restaurants are going to go out of business. All right, so business opportunities. You do not need a license to sell a business opportunity. You do not need a license to sell a business opportunity if it does not involve a lease or the sale of a building. So a news center, somebody who has some news racks, like at a train station, they may be selling you that their paper route. You don't need a real estate license to do that. But if you're selling a Dunkin' Donuts, or you're selling a car lot, or you're selling a bicycle shop, or a gas station, or a pizza place, and you're going to negotiate a lease, or you're going to have to buy the building, that you have to have a real estate license in order to sell the business. Now, what is a business worth? How do we evaluate what a business is worth? And it's just like evaluating what a stock is worth on the stock market. The reputation and the goodwill. Under the statute of frauds and the Uniform Commercial Code, there is a rule that says the sale of a business, the contract must be in writing. Any representations or warranties are going to be in the contract. If you're selling my son's restaurant that he closed, he has to transfer the liquor license, so he may sell the liquor license. If I were to sell my Remax office, I would have to transfer the franchise. If somebody is going to sell a Pepsi route, we have to transfer the distributorship. So we'd have to make sure that we understood how those things were going to happen. You might sign a covenant not to compete. If I was going to sell my school someday, the person who bought it from me would probably want me to sign a document called a forbearance, where I would agree not to open up again in the state of New Jersey. When you're selling a business, you have to assign the accounts receivable. If there's money owed, when the day the business is sold, who gets that money? Does the business get the money, or does the old owner get the money? So that all has to be negotiated in the contract. You also might have to assign a lease. The landlord may not want to assign the lease to the new buyer. He may not like the new buyer. So again, usually in leases, like we talked about earlier, there is a clause that says no assignment without written permission. And then we're going to go back to my son's restaurant again, because in my son's restaurant, the pizza ovens were permanently attached. He had brand new pizza ovens. and they're expensive. But a pizza oven in a business is a trade fixture. And a trade fixture is the personal property of the tenant. So my son was able to sell the pizza ovens, even though they were permanently attached to the building, because they were trade fixtures. So if you were going to buy a restaurant, you would want to know if the fixtures in there, the coolers or the ovens, if they were fixtures, if they were trade fixtures. Because if they were trade fixtures, they might belong to the previous tenant. You also have to obey the bulk sales and uniform commercial code. So 1,000,000 years ago, I bought a restaurant in Virginia Beach, and I got a really good deal on it. And it was an Italian restaurant, pizzeria and subs, right by the ocean front in Virginia Beach. But back then, there wasn't Costco and there wasn't Restaurant Depot. The only place that you could get high gluten flour and Italian pepperoni and sausage and mozzarella cheese was at Lasante Food or Roma Food in Piscataway in New York. So when I bought this restaurant for a really good price, the previous owner did not tell me she owed these guys $27,000. And they would not deliver the high gluten flour or the mozzarella cheese or the pepperoni to me unless I paid her bill, which was totally unfair, but I was stuck with it. So New Jersey has a law so that doesn't happen. And under this bulk sales and uniform commercial code, when you sell a business, the seller has to provide a list to the buyer of everyone to whom they owe money. So if that seller of that restaurant in Virginia Beach had given me that list, I would not have bought the business until she paid off Roma Food and Lasante Food. The next thing is the Bulk Transfer Act. The Bulk Transfer Act is an act that's designed to make the seller and buyer of a property responsible for collecting taxes that are due to the state, such as sales tax. Okay? So in a restaurant, when you sell food, you collect sales tax, and you're supposed to send that sales tax down the trend. So if you're about to go out of business, you can probably count on the fact that the owner of that business, that the owner of the business who's renting, is not paying the sales tax. So what happens is when you have a commercial endeavor that's selling in New Jersey, 10 days prior to closing, at least 10 days, it could be 11 days or 12 days or 20 days, but at least 10 days prior to closing, you have to let the state of New Jersey know that you are in fact going to sell the property, because then the state of New Jersey can do a quick auditing to see if the seller of the business owes them any taxes. And if you do not comply with this, and you buy the building anyway, or buy the business anyway, then the buyer is responsible for the unpaid taxes. So again, kind of similar to the Bulk Sales and Uniform Commercial Code, but the Bulk Transfer Act, Governor Christie put this into effect when he was in office, and it kind of made the people who handle the real estate transactions responsible for collecting those taxes for the state of New Jersey. Next thing is financing. Everybody's heard that 95% of all businesses go broke within the first 5 years. Why it's going to be a long time before all these small businesses come back. So how do you sell a business? Well, you know, a business is, it's not guaranteed that it's going to last forever. So how do you sell a business? Either pay cash for it or you ask for seller financing. A bank is not going to lend you the money to buy a business, except in extreme circumstances. Even an SBA loan, if you can get one, Small Business Administration loan, that loan still has to be secured by real property. So if you're going to get an SBA loan, you might have to put a lien against your house. The next things we have to consider is depreciation. So everything, you know, when you buy something, when you buy a durable good, whether it's a car or whether it's a refrigerator, the IRS publishes a depreciation schedule. So let's say you're buying a bus company. And you're not buying any real estate, you're just buying his contracts for the bus company. Well, let's say the depreciation on buses is 7 years, and all those buses are 7 years old. That means they've been fully depreciated. And it means you will not get any further depreciation allowance. And that is a consideration into the value of the building, because those are the value of the business, because those depreciation allowances sometimes reduce your taxable income. So again, you've got to be aware of how far along in the depreciation schedule the assets are. And in Trump's tax cuts, when he put his tax cuts into effect, he said that on durable goods, the first $28,000 you spent was able to be depreciated in 1 year instead of over 7 years. So you could go out and buy a car, and again, the car had to be over 6,500 pounds GVW. But if you bought a car for that amount of money, you could depreciate it all in the first year. So whatever you paid for the car would come off of your income. So, that's a really good thing. So again, you need to know where everything is in depreciation. All right, and then we've got all kinds of businesses, whether you're cutting lawns or you're making pizza dough or you've got a walk-in cooler, all different kinds of businesses. Now, businesses are listed on the MLS, even though you may not need a real estate license to sell them. And as we see these things that are listed, they talk about how many reviews they have and how good their reviews are, because that adds to the goodwill, that adds some value to what the business is worth, the goodwill. Reviews add for goodwill, and this is something that's listed on the computer. You can see people are saying nice things about it. You find it on the MLS. These are active listings on the MLS. They'll tell you how much the revenue is. They'll tell you how much the expenses are. They may tell you how long the lease is, and if you're able to assume the lease. And again, businesses are tough. You're not guaranteed to make money. This is a more in-depth version of a rental listing, and a lot of these are in fact food places. They're probably not worth anything right now because of Corona. There's no stream of income in these things. Without a stream of income, the concept is not really worth much. Okay, this is the state of New Jersey's form for your division of taxation for your bulk transfer. This is where you're going to tell them that you're going to have the sale so they can check to see if you owe any taxes. And again, this has to be filed 10 days prior to closing. So here is a Legacy Real Estate has a restaurant for sale, and they're telling you what the expenses are, what kind of heat it has. The square footage is 1,500. This is not a really good rental listing in terms of how they filled it out. You see here they have trade fixtures listed, but trade fixtures might be the property of the previous tenant. Any questions? You need a license to sell a vending machine route with machines. So you would need a license to sell them if the route with machines had leases in the buildings you put them in. If you didn't have a lease in the buildings you put them in, you just had a license. And remember, a license means temporary revocable permission, then you wouldn't need a real estate license. If you have a lease, then you need a real estate license.
Hey, Bruce, can you go over the uniform commercial code?
So let's go back to that. So the bulk sales and uniform commercial code, when you're selling a business as the seller, you have an obligation to tell the buyer to whom you owe money. You have an obligation to tell the buyer to whom you owe money. So you don't get stuck in that same situation that I did, where I bought it from somebody who owed my vendors money, and then my vendors wouldn't sell me the goods until I paid off their loans, their invoices.
Okay.
And this is not a specific form or a state form. This is just like a spreadsheet with those numbers on them that you certify. The Bulk Transfer Act, that is a specific state form. Here it is. And this is where you're letting the state know that you're selling a business or a commercial entity. And that's what they term it. You know, there was some question at first, does a two-family house count as a commercial entity? And some attorneys actually send this out on two-family houses. Some attorneys who are real anal about all the rules and regulations. Many attorneys have interpreted that this does not need to be sent out on a two-family house. And again, that's something you would want to talk with your attorney about. This is a government form, it goes to Trenton. The other one is just a spreadsheet that tells everyone to whom they owe money. Sometimes you'll have things like liquor licenses for sale. There's always a lot of liquor licenses for sale. They sell for a lot of money. You can see we've got liquor licenses here, just the licenses for $700,000. That's a lot of money. We have people, my friend Ron, the restaurant broker, he specializes as a real estate broker and only selling restaurants. A lot of restaurants for sale right now. Here's your vending machine business, by the way. A seller will train if needed, 30 hours a week, 15 vending machines with 5 years contract. So if this person, this is in the MLS, so obviously this person has a real estate license. The agent who's listing it has a real estate license, but the owner of this vending machine route might be able to have somebody without a real estate license sell this for them because it doesn't involve a lease. It might only involve permission, which is not the same as a lease. It might only involve permission to have those in people's buildings. Here is another business for sale where the gross scheduled income is $160,000. The annual owner's expenses are $20,000. So when you're looking at this kind of a listing for a business, you have to understand this business isn't really making $140,000 a year, because the owner, even though it's $160,000 in income and only $20,000 in expenses, it's not making $140,000 a year because the owner is there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So they're not counting that that contribution to his income within this $20,000 owner's expenses. And most businesses sell for a function of a multiple of their net operating income. So if this guy said his building was making, his income was 160 and his owner's expenses were 20, it looks like he's saying it's $140,000 worth of net income. Looks like he's saying $140,000 worth of net income, but he's not counting what he pays himself. And so if a investor were to come and buy that restaurant or buy whatever this is, if he were to come and buy that, he would have to hire somebody to run it. And if he paid that person $100,000 a year, then the net would only be $40,000 a year. So if the business sold at 3 times net, it would only be worth 120, as opposed to selling to 3 times 140. See, it's 28. It'd be 42,000, 420,000. That makes a big difference. Okay, we did this chapter last night. One more chapter tonight. It's land description. And I always joke around that my favorite real estate agent was George Washington, the first American president. And what George Washington did, he was trained as a surveyor. By the way, up until recently, we actually used the same tools to survey that George Washington used. This is a transit level. We're starting to use different tools now, but not yet, not yet. George Washington actually was awarded land in Virginia and Maryland as pay for him being an officer in the British Army. George Washington had served in the British Army. He was a colonel in the French and Indian Wars. And he was paid in land. He subdivided the land by surveying it all and selling it off for a profit. He did such a good job on it. His fellow officers had him do the same thing for them, and he charged them a percentage. which makes him a real estate agent. So we use a meets and bounds description in our property description in New Jersey. A meets and bounds description has a point of beginning and a point of ending. It always works clockwise. So we start at a point of beginning here, and then we go 100 feet north, and then we go 50 feet east, and then we go 100 feet south, and then we go 50 feet west. And we get back to the point of beginning. And that description defines the parameter of our piece of property. And that is known as a legal description. It's a meets and bounds description. Meets and bounds means distance and direction. And we call it a legal description. The reason we call it a legal description is because it's used on deeds. Remember, a deed has to be accompanied with a legal description. That's a meets and bounds description. And it's used on mortgages. Okay, that's why we call it a legal description, because it's used on deeds and mortgages. A meets and bounds description has things called benchmarks and monuments. Monuments are always natural or man-made. Benchmarks are always man-made. This is a benchmark. Surveyors know exactly where this is, so they can cite off of this, and it gives them an exact bearing from when they start. So in New Jersey, our most complete and most definitive description of where a property is a meets and bounds definition. And the meets and bounds definition is created by a surveyor. And the meets and bounds definition is a legal description, and it has to accompany a deed and accompany a mortgage. The next level of where our property is a lot and block number. A lot and block number is used by the your municipal tax collector, so he knows where your property is by lot and block for tax purposes. And a lot and block number is also used in a condo, because a condo has a unit deed with a lot and block number. A condo has a unit deed with a lot and block number, but the unit deed in a condo refers to a master deed. And the master deed in a condo has a meets and bounds definition. Okay, so we use lot and block in condos, and for tax purposes, that's the next one down the hierarchy is lot and block. And the lowest property definition is the address. Your address is just where the mailman delivers your mail. You can change your address just by calling up and asking the town to change your address. Actually, calling up and asking the post office to change your address. So in terms of the hierarchy, the most complete is meets and bounds. The next one is lot and block number. And the lowest is the address. Now, west of the Mississippi River, when you start looking at the states like Idaho and Iowa, they start having straight lines instead of curved lines like New Jersey does, because west of the Mississippi River, but before you get to California, they use a government survey system. The government survey system divides things into these rectangles. Rectangles are known as sections and townships, but we do not use that in New Jersey. So that is never an answer in New Jersey. We do not use the government survey system in New Jersey. That's used in states like Idaho and Iowa. We use meets and bounds definition. Something you're going to have to know for the test. It's just a plain old-fashioned, straight-out question, and that's that an acre is 43,560 square feet. Now, somebody in class came up with a method to remember this. He says an acre is 711 because 4 and 3 is 7, and 5 and 6 is 11. So an acre is 43,560 square feet. An acre is a measurement of area. An acre is a measurement of area. 43,560 square feet, 711. Remember, you're going to have to know that number for the test. A mile is 5,280 feet. That might be something else you have to know for the test, because they're going to tell you somebody has a piece of property that has 10 acres on it, and it is a mile deep. How wide is it? So if it has 10 acres, 43,560, and it's 10 acres, so another 0, because it's 10 acres. So on 10 acres, we have 43,000 435,600 square feet. Feet to the second power. And if we know one side of it is a mile long, we divide it by 5,280, and then that would tell us how deep it is, how wide it is. So let's do that real quick. So 435,600 divided by 5,280, that's going to be 82.5 feet deep. 82.5 feet deep. Okay, that's a typical question on the test. That would depend on you knowing. That would depend on you knowing that a mile is 5,280 feet, and an acre was 43,560 square feet. Sometimes on property descriptions they talk about front foot. If a property is 50 by 100, if a property is 50 by 100, we say 50 by. Oops. If we say 50 by 100, the number we put first means the width along the street. So if this property is 50 by 100, this must be the street, right? Because it's 50 feet wide and it's 100 feet deep. One of the questions they might give you on the test is they might tell you if we have a front setback and a rear setback, what's the biggest size house you can build? So we have a 50 by 100 lot. We might have a front setback of 20, which means the front of our house can't be any closer than 20 feet to the street. And we have a rear setback of 30, let's say, which means the rear of the house can't be any closer than 30 feet to the rear of the property line, and 10 feet setbacks on each side. What's the biggest house we can build? So we know that we have a 100 foot here, and we're going to subtract the 20 and subtract the 30, which leaves us the deepest the property could be is 50. And we have 50 feet along the front, but we're going to subtract 10 and 10. So we know that the biggest this can be along the front is 50 minus 10 and 10 is 30. And so if we do 30 times 50, the biggest one-story house we can have is 1,500 square feet. And sometimes they trick you because they ask for the biggest two-story house, and you would just double it. It would be 3,000 square feet. So that is a question that is quite often on the test. All right, that's going to be it for tonight because I think just saw it was our last slide. And we will do a non-required, no attendance mandatory tomorrow night class for at 7:30, and it's just going to be one chapter on appraising. Very important chapter, a fun chapter too. I think it's a fun chapter to do. And I'll record this one and I'll record tomorrow night's one. We'll get them up there soon. I will send everybody back out. I think that somebody said they didn't get the test, so I'll attach the tests out and send them all back out again in the morning. So you guys can start playing around with some of that stuff. And we'll see you tomorrow night. Okay.
Bruce, please don't forget to send the YouTube
Yep.
from yesterday. I didn't get it.
Okay.
This
YouTube
is down
today.
there.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right, guys. That's it then. See you,
All right.
see you tomorrow night. Good night.
Good night. Thanks, Bruce.
Thank you, Bruce.
Oh, wait. Sorry.
Thank you.
There's questions. Wait.
Oh, what?
I was too quick.
We're not going to do the questions today?
No, I don't have any questions ready for today.
Okay.
Okay. So, Mr. Singh, you can give me a call. 908-202-5738. 908-202-5738. And if you have a question or you want to ask off the air, I'll be happy to do that. All right. That's it then. We'll see you guys tomorrow night.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Good night.